Hi, welcome to our YouTube channel from Underline Church of the Nazarene. This is not only for our church, but for everyone out there. And welcome to the 23rd episode of our journey through the New Testament. We're starting to get toward the back end of the New Testament where the books get kind of small. And we're not going to go through every single book because some of them are just pretty inconsequential and small. And yes, I just called a biblical book inconsequential, but it's kind of true. And so I still don't know why 2nd John and 3rd John are in there, but so we'll skip over those. So today I want to go to a little book that's actually quite small, but I think is enormously consequential. And that book is Philemon. Philemon is a book that not many people know. Now, I know I've just skipped over 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, and there's a reason for that, and we'll come back later and pick those two up. But the reason why I want to get to Philemon is a book that's distinctively and definitely Pauline, meaning it was written by Paul. And I think if we really read it, we can gain a lot of insight into Paul's actual theology. And so I want to do that today. Let me set the stage for Philemon, and one of the reasons why I want to deal with Philemon is I think it is particularly appropriate for discussion today in 2019. You hear a lot of, I think, false and misleading information. Paul was a misogynist. He hates women. Paul was for slavery because in one of his letters, Ephesians, it says, "Slaves, obey your masters." Well, we have to be careful because, once again, Paul did not write in 2019. And sometimes the words that he used mean something completely different now. If we want to talk about what Paul felt about slavery, we would go to the book of Philemon. So, Philemon, as it turns out, was a wealthy patron, probably supporter of Paul. And as a wealthy individual, he probably had slaves at his employ in the first century. Now, right away, when I say slaves, the problem is you and I, we go to 1750 Georgia. And the North American context of slavery, which was racial, and it was chattel slavery. This is not the case in the Roman Empire. Slaves were paid. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul kind of had to urge the people not to voluntarily become one. And that's because if you were a Roman slave, it was probably a higher level on the socioeconomic ladder than if you were a day laborer or a tent maker. Sometimes slaves were quite well paid. After a period of time, or after you've made a certain amount of money, you could buy your own freedom. You could make a change in your circumstances. That was not the case here in North America. And Roman slavery was not racial. So it was also probably 80% of society were classified as slaves. So anyway, Philemon would have been a person who had many people underneath him on the economic ladder at his employ. They would have been called slaves, but that has nothing to do with what we call slaves in our culture. So, there was a man named Onesimus. Onesimus was a slave. Probably both Philemon and Onesimus at one point heard Paul preach, and maybe heard a message about freedom in Christ. Well, Onesimus was impressed, and he wanted to join Paul and be part of Paul's ministry. And it seems that Onesimus ran off and went to be where Paul was. Philemon, maybe hearing that Onesimus was going to be where Paul was, contacted Paul. Now, Paul had a problem. Paul had two friends. On one side, you had Onesimus, the slave. On the other side, you had Philemon, the slave patron. And here was the issue. They were both appealing to Paul on the circumstances of Onesimus. And a lot hung in the balance. What would Paul's response be? Would he tell Philemon that he can't have Onesimus back? Or would he order the slave Onesimus back to Philemon? We have Paul's answer. And in Philemon, Paul walks this interesting middle ground. And he says this. He says, Philemon, you owe me your very life. And even though I could compel you to do this, I'm not, because I want this to be freely chosen behavior on your part. So here's what I'm doing. I'm sending Onesimus back to you. Onesimus probably wanted Paul to say, Philemon, you can't have him. He's mine now, and he's going to join me. Paul looks at Onesimus and says, Onesimus, here's what I want to do. I want to send you back. And I want you to trust me. Think about that just for a second. Paul is trying to wrap his arms around both these friends. And he says to Philemon, I want you not only to accept him back, but when I send him back to you, I want you to accept him back as a brother, an equal, and no longer as a slave. See, here's the problem with Paul. We want him to make this modern day declaration that sounds good in our publicity-driven, press conferenced world. We want Paul to say all slavery is wrong and it's bad. And again, we have 1750s Georgia in mind. But that's not what Paul did. Paul had other concerns. And so he says basically to Philemon, I want this to be a freely chosen decision for you. Because if you're hurt, if you feel like you're harmed in the process, then you feel like you can't really be free. And he looks at Onesimus. If you feel like you're harmed in the process and you're being restrained, then you can't really be free. I have to get to this point of, here's this word, reconciliation. And so that's what Paul's trying to effect. And he adds this phrase in Philemon. You can read it for yourself. It's really short. You can knock it off in about a minute and a half. Paul says this to Philemon. If there's anything, if this costs you anything, charge it to my account. I'll pay you back. Because Paul is really trying to make Philemon whole, and he's trying to make Onesimus whole. Paul is not trying to referee a 2019 perceived dispute. He's in a different age where slavery meant a different thing, but it still created a problem. So where would Paul get such an idea that he could go to Philemon and say, hey, if you have debts here, I'm going to step in and I'm going to pay your debts for you so you can be free. Sounds an awful lot what Jesus did for us. Paul's applying that very same thing to a different circumstance. See, we do things cheaply. We want to put it on a bumper sticker and make other people feel bad and feel like we're virtuous because we take a political position. Paul was extending himself so two people can feel whole. Now, we don't really know what happened as a result of this letter. We don't know if Philemon accepted Onesimus back as a brother, or if he says, yeah, now you're mine now because you're back here. However, we do have some early church traditions that one of the first bishops of Colossae was a man named Onesimus. It seems fairly likely that Onesimus was accepted back by Philemon as a brother and went on to full participation in the church. Onesimus the slave, Philemon the wealthy patron, and a few years later, the slave is leading that whole region of the church. That's what Philemon's about. It's a window into Paul. It's a window into what's going on in that world. It's a window to what Paul really thought about an issue. And when we talk about it, we rarely go to this very small but very important book called Philemon. I want to thank you for joining us. Ask you to subscribe to our channel, like us, and please tune in again next week where we'll have a different topic. If you have any question, if you want to argue with us, if you want to say we got something wrong, please put in our comments. We'll be happy to address it in a future installment, in a future episode. But until then, I'll see you next week. Have a wonderful week.